Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 3, Comparing and Contrasting. So this podcast is going to be different from the first two because I'm not going to be giving you new content here. Instead, this week will be the first of 3 podcasts that focus on answering the AP World History essay questions. So there are 3 types of essay questions in AP World History. I'm going to do 3 podcasts, so you can probably guess that I'm going to be covering 1 type of essay per podcast. And this week, we'll look at the compare and contrast essay. You will write 2 compare and contrast essays in this unit, Unit 1, Foundations. In Unit 2, we are going to look at the change in continuity over time essay, I believe. And in Unit 3, we will look at the document-based question. Maybe it's the other way around. I don't have my course outline in front of me right now. But in Unit 4 and 5, we'll revisit these essays before writing the Advanced Placement World History exam. And on the AP World History exam, you will answer multiple choice questions, not unlike the questions you're answering at the end of each week. And you'll also answer 3 essay questions. And you can probably guess it, you will be answering 1 compare and contrast essay, 1 change in continuity essay, and 1 document-based question essay. So let's see, our question for this week is compare and contrast the rise of civilization in one of the early river valley civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, or the Indus Valley. For the purpose of this example, I'm going to stick to Egypt and Mesopotamia. So I want to compare and contrast the rise of civilization in Egypt and Mesopotamia. When answering a compare and contrast question, you want to make sure that you're addressing both the similarities and the differences between the 2 civilizations being compared. So the first step in the compare and contrast question, you want to brainstorm as much information as you possibly can. With the compare and contrast, you'll want to use something similar to the diagram that I have up here, which is essentially a Venn diagram. So characteristics that apply to both in the middle, Egypt on one side and Mesopotamia on the other side, or whatever 2 civilizations you're comparing. And you want to get down as much information as you can. How are they similar? How are they different? So we want to consider what were the factors behind the rise of these civilizations. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia benefited from the Fertile Crescent package that Jared Diamond writes about in Guns, Germs, and Steel. So this is things like barley and wheat and cattle. Civilization in both Egypt and Mesopotamia emerged in the valleys of great rivers, the Nile in Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. But there's a key difference between the 2. The Nile is a predictable river. It floods more or less the same every year, and anytime there was a disaster, it was more of an exception than a regular occurrence. And this is very different from the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. These rivers are much less predictable, and when they flooded, they often destroyed cities and crops, caused people to starve to death, caused a lot of suffering. And this, I think, is a key comparison because it would impact how Egyptians and Mesopotamians saw the world. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia had cities, but cities in Egypt were less important than in Mesopotamia. Egyptian society was a lot more rural. And this is really because Egypt was protected by natural barriers, meaning it was surrounded by the desert and by the sea. In Mesopotamia, people were more prone to attack from outsiders, attack from all directions, so cities were important for protection. Egypt experienced more or less continuous rule for thousands and thousands of years. You had the Old Kingdom Egypt, Middle Kingdom Egypt, and New Kingdom Egypt, with only short periods of upheaval separating the 3 kingdoms. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, was constantly being taken over by new peoples. So it started with the Sumerians, and then we had people like the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, and so on. So now it's popular for historians to argue that these differences between Egypt and Mesopotamia really impacted the way that Egyptians and Mesopotamians viewed the world, and they led to basically a different worldview for Egyptians and Mesopotamians. Egyptians, for their part, tended to view the world as being an orderly place. For the Egyptians, the sun was God. God was the sun, literally. So looking up at the sky was like looking at God. Each night, God would sink into the underworld and fight off the monsters. Every morning, he would rise again. So the rise of the sun every morning was the rebirth of God every day, sort of an optimistic idea. The sunrise represented literally the triumph over good over evil. So the sun would always rise, the Nile would keep flowing predictably, the crops would grow every year. Mesopotamian people, on the other hand, saw the world as being more disorderly and more random, and we can infer that just based on primary documents that you read from Egypt versus primary documents that you read from Mesopotamia. So the worldview in Mesopotamia was different. It was less optimistic, viewed the world as being more random, more disorderly. One of the reasons the Tigris and the Euphrates, there was constant flooding that was unpredictable. It destroyed villages, and also it was a really violent place where people were constantly fighting each other over resources. So Mesopotamia wasn't an empire like Egypt was. It was more a series of city-states that often fought each other. And the power of these feuding groups would sort of rise and fall fairly constantly. So these are some major differences. Can we think of anything else? Okay, so writing. Both civilizations have writing. Mesopotamians have cuneiform, and Egyptians have their hieroglyphics. It's like monumental building. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia participated in monumental building, but Egypt had stone and they made pyramids, whereas in Mesopotamia they had mud brick and they made ziggurats. Now, the fact that the pyramids are more impressive than the ziggurats partly has to do with the fact that the pyramids are made of the stone, which will stand the test of time, and the ziggurats were made of mud brick, which is much, much less durable. But also the pyramids were on a grander scale than any of the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, and this probably reflects that at the time when the pyramids were built, it was a time of plenty in Egypt. The state could afford to spend resources and use labor to build them. Egypt probably wasn't involved in major wars at the time that were taking up a lot of their resources. Another comparison you might want to look at is how women were treated in Mesopotamia versus how women were treated in Egypt. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia were patriarchal societies, that is to say, both were societies that were dominated politically and religiously and economically by men. But Egypt appears to be the early civilization where women had the most freedom. So it speculates a little bit on some of the reasons why in the Bulliet textbook.